Today we'll be looking at Task 10 in your A Christmas Carol booklet, which is where we meet Marley's ghost for the first time. Now, if you watch the film or listen to the audiobook, you will see that Dickens creates a very gothic scene before he introduces the first ghost into the story. The streets are so foggy, Scrooge can barely see from one side of the road to the other. It is a dark and chilly evening. As he reaches his front door, he is for a moment struck by the sight of old Jacob Marley's face taking the place of his door knocker, but he dismisses this as humbug. As he goes upstairs, he sees a ghostly hearse passing him on the stairs. Scrooge's house is a perfect setting for a ghost story, with only one candle to see by and one coal on the fire. It is dark, shadowy, and chilly. All alone in this echoey, empty house, Scrooge thinks he sees Marley's face appear in the tiles around his fireplace. Then he hears the bells ringing and the slow dragging clanking of chains before the ghost finally makes its entrance. Let's read the scene. Who are you? Ask me who I was. Who were you then? Said Scrooge, raising his voice. You're particular for a shade. He was going to say to a shade, but substituted this as more appropriate. In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. Can you sit down? Asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. I can. Do it then. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that, in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me, observed the ghost. I don't, said Scrooge. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know, said Scrooge. Why do you doubt your senses? Because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of his bones. To sit staring at those fixed, glazed eyes in silence for a moment would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though this ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated, as by the hot vapour from an oven. You see this toothpick, said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. I do, replied the ghost. You are not looking at it, said Scrooge. But I see it, said the ghost, notwithstanding. Well, returned Scrooge, I have but to swallow this and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug. At this the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, he said, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, replied the ghost, do you believe in me or not? I do, said Scrooge, I must. But why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me? Now, you've got two questions in your booklet to have a little think about, and hopefully you'll see that I've tried to help you with some of my highlighting there as we've gone through. So how does Dickens show that Scrooge does not easily believe in the ghosts? Well, if you see from my highlighting, I've tried to highlight in pink there for you some moments where you can really see him quite clearly being very disbelieving. So he's quite clearly says, you don't believe in me, and Scrooge says, I don't. What evidence would you have? I don't know. You may be a bit of undigested beef or potato or mustard or a crumb of cheese, all of those sort of things really suggest that Scrooge is being quite disbelieving. And it seems he's quite arrogant, he's very set in his ways, and he's not going to be easily shifted in the way he thinks or feels about things. And that might be why we are given such a disbelieving character at the beginning. Then in our second question, we're asked, how does Scrooge change by the end of this extract? Highlight a quotation that supports this idea. And if you see, I've tried to do this in yellow for you. So we have kind of a sense that although he's pretending that he doesn't really care, that he's pretending he's not really bothered by this ghost at all, he's really bothered by these glazed eyes, and he really realizes that they're going to affect him in quite a horrible way. He also notices that the ghost has this kind of infernal atmosphere. It's got its own sort of, as if it's coming from a different place altogether. So things around it are moving, even though there is no air to shift it in the real world. He also begins to show signs of real fear. He's held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon as he hears the spirit crying and shaking its chains. And he fell upon his knees and asked for mercy. Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? So you can see, although he's pretending and trying to put up a very good front of saying, oh, it's just humbug, actually, as the scene progresses, he's showing more and more fear and potentially more and more belief. So that moves us on to reading onto the paragraph next. It is required of every man, the ghost returned, that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness. Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you? Scrooge trembled more and more. Or would you know it, pursued the ghost, the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. Jacob, he said imploringly, old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob. I have none to give, the ghost replied. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to some other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. You must have been very slow about it, Jacob, Scrooge observed in a businesslike manner, though with humility and deference. Slow? The ghost repeated. 7 years dead, mused Scrooge, and travelling all the time. The whole time, said the ghost. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. You travel fast, said Scrooge. On the wings of the wind, replied the ghost. You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chains so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. Oh, captive, bound, and double-ironed, cried the phantom, not to know that ages of incessant labour by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. Business? Cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. It held up its chain at arm's length as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. At this time of the rolling year, the spectre said, I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which would lead the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me? Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me, cried the ghost. My time is nearly gone. I will, said Scrooge, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray. How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. That is no light part of my penance, pursued the ghost. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank ye. You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits. Now, as you may see, as we were reading through the extract, I've highlighted quite a few quotations that we will be looking at as in the course of this webinar, and that might help you answer the questions that are in your booklet. But first of all, let's have a little look at some tricky vocabulary, because of course it is a Victorian novel, and there's some words that we don't use that much today. So fettered, it just means chained and restrained. And Marley talks a lot about these chains, and he also describes the fact that Scrooge himself has even longer chains because he's had 7 long years further to develop these chains. We'll talk about what those chains symbolise and the importance of those chains in a moment. We also see the word girded, which just means encircled with a belt or band. Now, a habit of, and I suppose it still happens today, but particularly in an era where often people were laid out to rest for quite a long time before they were buried, so that people could go and see the body laid out in their home. They would place a kind of scarf around the underneath the chin and to the top of the head, just to keep the mouth closed. And so you can see that in the scene, he has to undo his own kind of this kind of band in order to let his mouth drop open so that he can speak, which again would be a really dark and kind of nasty sort of sign of his ghostly presence. Ponderous just means slow and clumsy, and it's a ponderous chain. So he's weighted down as he moves through the earth now. He's weighted always with this ponderous, this slow, clumsy chain that he has to carry everywhere. So that's part of his punishment for everything he's done in his sinful lifetime. Humility just means to be modest or humble, and that does suggest a change in Scrooge. So when it talks about him speaking with humility and deference, it suggests that even though he's still questioning the ghost and maybe sounding a little bit sort of sarcastic at times, he actually is doing so with humility, and he's changing his opinion a little bit and starting to be a bit more respectful. Again, that word deference goes along with that. He's submitting, he's being quite polite, quite respectful as the scene goes on, because he's realising that this ghost has come to give him a very important message. Incessant, endless. And the ghost really talks about this incessant misery, this incessant remorse that he has to suffer now. He realises, as the scene develops, you hear him describe how he's realised that throughout his lifetime he had so many opportunities to reach out and help people. He had so many opportunities to see the suffering and the poverty and the need that were out there, and he didn't do so in his lifetime, and now he can't do anything about it. So he's just having to endlessly walk the earth in a state of remorse. And that brings us to the next word. Remorse just means regret or guilt. And so this is the ghost's purgatory. This is his suffering. He has to live with the regret, the guilt, of not having behaved very well during his lifetime and not really being able to do much about it now that he's dead. Forbearance is just means patience and self-control or tolerance. Benevolence is kindness. So that's another word that might have made you sort of worry. Unavailing, achieving little. So he can achieve very little in his lifetime now, in his afterlife. And the penance. Now, this really brings us to the very Christian context of this story. And Marley very, very much symbolises that Christian context, because he is a symbol of penance. He is suffering the punishment that he has to inflict, that he inflicts upon himself, and the endless repentance that he feels because he didn't do what he needed to do in lifetime because he was sinful. And in order to make right his sins, he has to undergo this penance, which will allow him, hopefully in future times, to achieve his way to the afterlife, to heaven. Procuring just means to obtain or to get something. And he's surrounded by an infernal atmosphere, sort of as an atmosphere of the hell or the underworld, it would seem. And yet it feels as if he's more in a state of purgatory, kind of in-between state, rather than in hell itself, because it seems strange that he's allowed to come out of hell. If he were in hell itself, it would be strange that he would be feeling this remorse or regret, or be able to actually make any contact with Scrooge. The religious context. So let's have a little look at this in a little detail. So you were asked in your booklet, why does Marley's ghost say that he has been condemned to walk the earth for all time? We've talked about that a little bit. Where he failed to help others, he walked on by when he had a chance. He failed to realise that mankind was his business, and he makes a big thing in this scene, and I highlighted it for you, of repeating this idea mankind was his business. And he repeats and repeats the idea of business, because on earth he was so fixated by his actual economic business of making money, of being a moneylender, his greedy desire to achieve wealth. And he forgot that actually the most important business that he actually had on earth was to care for others and to care for other humans. So that's a really important reason why he is now condemned to walk the earth for all time. And that links to what I've just said, that he cared only about his business of making money. So in a Christian context, that greed is one of the sort of 7 deadly sins, and he was incredibly greedy, and now he deserves to suffer for that in his afterlife. A key word for you to sort of get hold of here, which links to this religious context, is the idea of purgatory. So if you haven't heard of that term before and you haven't defined it yet, it's the conditional process or place of purification. So in the Christian and Roman Catholic belief, if you die, you'll have you'll go to purgatory for a while, and it will allow you to purify, and you'll be in a place of temporary punishment before then going on to die in a state of grace and be made ready for heaven. So it's a sort of in-between place where you sort of suffer for a while, and you may be punished for your sins, but then it's making you ready to go to heaven. So that potentially is where Marley is being described as being at this point. Is he in hell or is he in purgatory? To suggest that he's able to get out of hell and talk to someone is probably unusual. So how is he shown to be in purgatory? Well, he's being doomed to walk the earth for eternity and to suffer as he walks, this slow and ponderous chain he has to pull behind him. He now sees the suffering of his fellow men, but can no longer do anything to help them. And that would just increase and intensify his suffering every time. So all of the suffering he now sees, he's just powerless and unable to do anything about it. That heavy chain represents every sin that he committed in life, and he has to pull it with him everywhere he goes. And you see him literally crying out in despair and suffering. So whilst he's talking to Scrooge, he's showing his own suffering, and he's trying to warn him of the suffering that he faces. So the chains, they are very strongly symbolic, aren't they, of the sins that have been committed. And every single time someone like Marley fails to care, fails to do something that's a good thing on earth, or every time he commits a sin, he has forged another link in that chain. It's an interesting idea that's always got the kind of that industrial imagery as well of forging a chain, because remember, Dickens is talking during the Industrial Revolution, and it was within that kind of context that many people were very, very poor. Many of the workers were suffering greatly from incredibly poor conditions, and some people were getting incredibly rich on the back of those people. So you could say that Dickens is kind of linking this into that industrial context where the rich were feeding off of the poor, and that was making their sins so much more abiding. He carries his heavy chain with him in purgatory as a form of punishment and to remind him of the sins he's committed in his lifetime. And he obviously warns Scrooge that he also has a chain that is much longer and heavier than Marley's. Marley died 7 years before, so Scrooge has had a lot longer to work on his own chain. He will be doomed to face the same fate as Marley, an eternity of walking the earth in remorse, because he is also failing to reach out and care for others while he's alive. And he tells him the very clear warning, you're going to be visited by 3 ghosts. Now, that is kind of a warning because it's a scary thing to hear, but it's also an opportunity. And Marley actually says, I procured this for you. I got this for you. I actually managed to get them to allow whoever this is to allow these ghosts to come and visit you in order to give you a chance of change before it's too late. So some of the quotations that I've highlighted in the booklet and which I may want to sort of look at in more detail, I've put in these bubbles here, and you'll also see these in your booklet as well. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. You've got that little triad there, rest, stay, linger. He cannot ever be at rest anymore, and it's just emphasized there that he can never stop this endless torment of wandering the earth. And it's all because his spirit never reached out. And it really connects to the Christian idea of having a soul that, or a spirit within you that should connect with other spirits on earth. And his spirit never did. He was always contained within the narrow limits of his own money-changing hole, as he describes it. And to describe his business as a whole really suggests it's a kind of unpleasant and almost disgusting place to have spent his entire life and never to have stepped outside to see the things he could have done that were good in the world. We've got the chain symbolism in this other booklet, in this other bubble. I wear the chain I forged in life, replied the ghost. I made it link by link and yard by yard. And this suggests that over a lifetime, we can decide what we want to create. And for him, he just forged sin. And you see it's a very, very descriptive and sort of symbolic way of showing someone's sins actually on them. Business, cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. And I think he's being very ironic there because Scrooge has just asked him, well, you were always a good man of business, weren't you, Marley? And Scrooge's understanding of business is in making money and doing well and being wealthy. And he really retorts back by repeating this word business and almost throwing it back in Scrooge's face and saying, that wasn't what my business on earth was. And he tells him very, very clearly, all of these Christian qualities were his business: charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence, kindness. All of patience, all of these things that make you a good Christian person were his business on earth. And remember, if you flip back to a couple of scenes before, we saw Scrooge not being kind or benevolent to his nephew, not being patient or forbearing, not showing any care for the charity workers that came to his doorstep. So already we've seen Scrooge also failing to see any of these important aspects of his business on earth. It held up its chain at arm's length as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. A very, very physical sort of just demonstration, really, of his suffering and agony. And he literally throws the chain down, flings it down, to show that he's living in this state of permanent grief, permanent remorse, and he can never get out of it because of the way he acted on earth. So what methods does Dickens use to present Marley's ghost? Well, obviously we've seen it's a very, very gothic scene. He really builds up the scene around Marley's first entrance to create a lovely, terrifying, supernatural spectre, which has come to warn Scrooge that he must change. It begins with quite a lot of humorous banter from Scrooge, and Scrooge is kind of dismissing it, isn't he, and trying to lighten the tone and to almost pass off his own fear. But we quickly see this melt away as the ghost frightens Scrooge into a more respectful way of behaving. The ghost is physically described as very gruesome and disturbing, which makes it a lovely scene to act out or to put in a film, because he's a very physical presence, and his cries and his sort of chain rattling and the gruesome way that he actually takes the thing around his face around and his jaw would just drop down. All of those sort of things make him a very gruesome and effective ghost. The chains obviously are very symbolic of the sin and make it a very visual way of seeing the sin that he's committed. And as the scene develops, you'll see that Scrooge himself begins to change. So if we think about this novel starting with Scrooge being such a strong example of a sinner, such an extreme example of a sinful character, already we're seeing him start to sort of change a little bit. He goes from complete disbelief and almost arrogance to at least a state of fear and respect. And he shows a desire to learn more from this spirit. So he's opening up. And this little oyster of a man, this clammed up man who shows no feeling or concern for others, is starting at least to become a little bit more open. We see lots of Christian imagery, and he captures the importance of Christmas as a time for teaching people to be better and to follow the star, leading them to Christ. He talks about, why didn't I follow the star? Why didn't I allow myself to go out and reach out to people who were suffering and needed me? And in the Christian context, Jesus was born to take away the sins of man and allow them a hope of redemption. So the whole scene is wrapped up in this Christian imagery of a character who failed to see the Christian message when he was alive. And particularly at Christmas, when that is being exhibited in your nativity scenes and in your church services, he didn't see that, and he didn't understand that message when he was alive, and he's now suffering for it in his death. Marley expresses very strong despair in his long list, suggesting that his punishment seems absolutely endless and incessant. And he wails and flings his chain down, expressing his sorrow. So it's a very sort of demonstrative kind of ghost. The repetition of business several times to emphasize that he focused on the wrong business on his earth is perhaps the most important message he wants to leave Scrooge with. He contrasts the greed he demonstrated with the important business of caring for others. And if you remember, we saw Scrooge as someone that doesn't reach out to anyone. He's very isolated, he's very closed, and people wouldn't go to him for help at the beginning of this story. And this is an incredibly important part of his transformation if he can make it. So why is Marley's ghost important as a character? He's a physical representation of remorse and regret. He demonstrates the result of living a greedy and sinful life. He's a physical, literal representation of that. It kind of becomes symbolic of that. He's really important as acting as a warning to Scrooge, because Scrooge is actually living an even more sinful life of greed and isolation. So he's warning Scrooge of what is going to happen to him if he doesn't change his ways. He's very important to the Christian context of the story. He expresses the central belief that it is a sin not to care for others. Mankind was my business. Scrooge begins to change and at least fears and respects the ghost as a result of this scene. So we see Scrooge developing in this scene. And he introduces the plot line, you will be visited by 3 ghosts. So he forms a sort of point of kind of introduction to what's going to happen next. Well, thank you for listening, everybody, and I hope that was a helpful little webinar on Marley's Ghost. If you watch any film version of this, it's really well done, and normally the films make Marley's Ghost come across as a really interesting and exciting character. Thank you for listening. Bye.